The Pride Center of Edmonton provides a non-judgmental, welcoming space where people of all attractions, identities, and expressions can be themselves, find support, meet new people, and be part of a caring community. The center offers resources, volunteer opportunities, counseling, and sensitive and expert information and referrals for those seeking help. The center also organizes programs to help improve the social, mental, and physical health of the 2S LGBTQIA+ community. To learn more about making a donation, volunteering, or otherwise supporting and engaging with this organization, please visit pridecenterofedmonton.ca.
This is Dmitry Samarov from Chicago, Illinois, and I love listening to Vish Khanna's Creative Control because whether he's talking to a favorite musician or actor of mine or someone I've never heard of, it's as if he's introducing me to a new friend. And the way things are going, couldn't you use a new friend? Listen now.
To make your flexible monthly donation to Creative Control, please visit patreon.com/creativecontrol today.
Lou Barlow and John Davis are esteemed musicians, songwriters, singers, and old friends who respectively reside in the states of Massachusetts and North Carolina in the United States of America. After exchanging letters in the early 1990s, the pair began collaborating and released a cassette in 1993 called Walk Through This World with the Folk Implosion. Thanks to their prominent role on the 1995 soundtrack for the motion picture Kids and the band's hit single from that soundtrack, Natural One, Folk Implosion's profile rose and they inked a major label deal with Interscope Records, who released 1999's One Part Lullaby. Sadly, Davis left the band the next year, and he and Barlow rarely spoke for nearly 2 decades. After reconnecting during the first years of the COVID-19 pandemic, they began playing music and writing new songs, and on June 28, 2024, Joyful Noise presented us with the first new Folk Implosion album in 25 years. It's called Walk Thru Me, and it prompted Lou and John to join me for a spirited and in-depth conversation about the significance of college and community radio, how Lou and me first became friends at Sled Island in Calgary, Alberta, the punk rock humor and intellectualism exhibited by figures like Gerard, Cosloy, and Steve Albini in the 1980s and early 90s, John's early collaborative relationship with Will Oldham and why he didn't ultimately appear on Will's first album, how Lou and John first met, how the Folk Implosion's name is both an homage and a little dig at the Jon Spencer Blues Explosion, the great but somewhat odd experience of working on the soundtrack for the controversial 1995 film Kids, why the Folk Implosion ended and why it's back, how they made Walk Thru Me, touring, making new music, other future plans, and much more. A part of the Lionsgate Sound Network with the support of listeners like you who follow and subscribe to this listener-supported and donor-driven podcast, spread the word about it, leave nice reviews and ratings on your podcast platforms, and make flexible monthly donations at patreon.com/creativecontrol, which is the primary and most reliable way for me as a podcaster to make a living, and where a monthly subscription of $6 American or its currency equivalent means you can access every single episode of this show in its entirety, which is not the case without that subscription. Actually, in this particular case, you're just going to hear an excerpt of my conversation with the Folk Implosion. That conversation, by the way, it lasted around 2.5 hours, and everyone on the Patreon who's a subscriber gets to hear that conversation. So it's a long one, long for this show anyway. But again, you do have to be a subscriber to hear the whole episode, and I hope you'll consider supporting me and my work and gaining access to full episodes of the show at patreon.com/creativecontrol. Thanks in advance for your support. Speaking of support, I have additional support from Blackbird Music, a wonderful record store with bricks and mortar locations in Edmonton and Calgary, Alberta. and a website, blackbird.ca, where you can order records shipped right to your house if you can't make it into those stores. Say you want a copy of Walk Thru Me by the Folk Implosion. Go to blackbird.ca, type that in, see if you can't get it. I bet you can. Plus, in-kind support from independent businesses like Pizza Trocadero, The Bookshelf, and Planet Bean Coffee, respectively, in Guelph, Ontario, and Grandad's Donuts in Hamilton, Ontario. This is episode 896 of Creative Control, featuring the lovely and talented Lou Barlow and John Davis from the Folk Implosion, with your host, me, Vish Khanna. Please enjoy this excerpt from our conversation, and to hear the whole thing, again, subscribe to the show at patreon.com/creativecontrol. John, Lou alluded to the fact that you two might have met in Boston, but I want to get some more detail on that. How did you first encounter Lou? What were the circumstances? What was the context?
Well, I'd heard, like I said, I got a copy of the Wheat Forreston tapes through the mail before they were released, and had, just sent him a letter about it, along with some tapes of some things I'd been recording, and sort of began, kind of being pen pals and stuff, and talking about, like, have you heard this or that? And then he said he was moving to Somerville at some point, which is, adjacent to Boston, Cambridge. And he said, give me a kick if you see me around. I remember he said that in a letter. And I think I met him at introduced myself at a club called the Middle East upstairs. I forget what the show was, and the first thing he said to me was, "You're tall." But, like I remember we started having a pretty long conversation right away, and Lou's partner at the time, Kathleen, interrupted us and said, "I hate to interrupt you guys' male bonding, but I just wanted to say that, I really like this thing on your tape, how you sampled The Third Man, the Orson Welles, movie." And I was like, "Oh, thank you." But it was like funny. It was like just the first time we had a conversation that she would pick up on this male bonding thing and start parodying it.
That's good.
And then also prove that we listened to your tape. I mean, it was like, because it was very early on. So like John reaching out to me was like, it was like, I put out that tape for almost the sole purpose of making connection with people. I was like, I'm just going to go really basic and try to connect with people. Cause I needed to connect. And especially with this music that I was making that felt so important to me and so vital to who I was, but also felt so contrary to everything that I was seeing around me. I was like, well, if I want to meet somebody, if I want to meet a girl, if I want to, even in the cassette, I had like a little, I had a little lyric sheet, and and the note was a personal plea to a special someone on the lyric sheet. And that's really honestly what it was. Like I didn't have a whole lot of friends. Dinosaur Jr. was a fierce and important part of my life, but was also very challenging, for my young ego. So I really needed to reach out. I needed some love. I made that cassette totally. It was my offering. There's a lot of love on that cassette, and the people that initially contacted with me around that cassette are still some of the best friends that I have. And John was one, and he sent me these fucking wild cassettes of him. I'm just like, he took what I was doing and went further inside, just to the most, just before ASMR, kind of just the most careful, interesting transmissions, which my whole thing was like, we're making transmissions, and that's why my songs were short. I was like, I was making them almost like, I always took the model of, because I loved AM radio when I was a kid, and I loved Greenwich Mean Time, which is where there's just this like boom, boom, and then they come on with a recorded message. And I think AM radio too, and then shortwave. My friend had a shortwave radio when I was a kid, and I was just fascinated how things would just pop up out of this thing and just be anything. They could be like, could be sort of CIA kind of things of just these repeated words like Margot, Mana, Daba,
right.
Gaga, Bob, and they fade. And like, I was like, So I was very into this idea of things being short transmissions, and as opposed to like, 3 chorus, pop songs or song structure, because my introduction really to songwriting, to real songwriting that I felt and understood, was hardcore punk rock, which was like fucking amazing. 30-second songs, really stark proclamations about your your mental health. Done. So like right. I took that as like a thing, and then, but anyway, so when Jon sent me a tape, I was like, okay, this is my brother.
Okay.
This guy, I didn't say in my head, this is my brother. We didn't do that back then, but but thinking back on it now, I knew that Jon was like going to be, I just knew that I had someone who would listen to me, and I would listen to them. It's like, you've got my ear, you've got my ear. You've complimented me. You've done this. We've softened the ground, and now, but I was very intrigued by his letters as well. So I thought his letters were awesome. I liked his handwriting. I liked what he had to say. It was a very, very sweet thing. It was a very sweet connection. And then when I met him, I'm like, of course, you are who you are.
Lou, you just said something really fascinating. You said that the tape, Weed Forreston, was so full of love, and you were looking for connection. But you also just said back then you wouldn't describe him as your brother. Meaning, I think what you're getting at is, yes, you could articulate your feelings in your work, but you wouldn't have been able to do that like in a conversation. Is that a way of putting it?
Probably, yeah. I would say that there's, to be, there was a lot of like hardcore brotherhood, but I sort of cringe at brother. Like I just cringe at that language.
Okay.
It'd be hard for me. I wasn't like, brother. I'm like, bro, it's like, it's more we've become intimate. We've entered a conversation where we're friends.
Yeah.
And that is like, we were friends, and that meant a ton to me.
So based on Lou's description of your tape, Jon, and forgive me if this is mischaracterizing it, but it sounds like, were you into collage? Is that what the tape consisted of?
Well, that was sort of there are just a couple songs that were really skeletal that I could pinpoint that really influenced me. And one was the a cappella songs on the Trout Mask Replica album by Captain Beefheart.
Yeah.
And I grew up in a kind of hippie neighborhood in Cambridge where there was a lot of like love for like Folkways records and stuff like that. And so like those kind of like Folkways albums would have a lot of like a cappella English music on them. And there's something about the immediacy of that I liked. And then I also really liked from that Pink Moon album by Nick Drake, specifically the song No, where he only plays one guitar string on the whole thing. And it's just, there's no chords. He only touches one string. And so but that kind of like translating a sort of punk attitude to folk music is usually sort of deemed to be like, oh, I know what to expect from this. It's a formulaic chord changes and sort of truths that we can sort of relate to about living. I was sort of interested in these elements of like intimate vocals and skeletal guitars sort of making you uncomfortable the way that hardcore could make you uncomfortable the first time you hear it, before you got like kind of, after a while, like you listen to a lot of really loud hardcore, it became a new formula. So I just really wanted to make very minimal things. So there would be like a spoken word piece followed by...
Look, I just to put it, I'm just going to interrupt and just go, look, this was like a really, like a tape of song poems. It was like unlike anything I'd heard. Obviously, at that point I'd heard Dylan Thomas. I knew of experimental things. It was, I think, we were there and we were probably listening to the same radio stations at the same time. But I was like, it was just very unique. It was very and extremely sparse.
Stark, minimalism, I'm hearing. You're both talking about the directness of hardcore music.
Makes me want to hear it right now. I'm just like, let's go.
Do you still have the tape? Do you have the tape, Lou?
I have the tapes. I've got all the tapes, yeah. I got them all here.
So I reshoot all that stuff on a CD called Pure Night Plus that's on Spotify now. And sort of the further you go into it, the sparser it gets, because it goes chronologically in reverse from like 1993 to 1987 or so. So, there was songs that like I record, they're on that tape that I recorded in high school. My mother had a classical guitar that was kind of beat up, and that was what I played, but I think there was some awareness of people doing things in other art mediums that had that sort of collage sensibility of like sound collage and things like that, and John Cage and that kind of stuff. So, but it was mostly based on the voice and just trying to exploit the way that someone's voice that doesn't surrounded by a lot of support can make you kind of turn you in on yourself and make you kind of uncomfortable in a sort of interesting way I was interested in at that time.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for listening to Creative Control, as always. As you may have heard me mention, I recently lost my day job, and I've had a few conversations with people since who've said, you had a day job? I thought your podcast was your day job. When I explained why it hasn't been my day job to a friend, he suggested I should share some of this information with people like you listening right now. So, in short, unless they have some giant exclusive $1 million contract, podcasters are not paid to make stuff by companies like Apple and Spotify. Podcasters do not make any money from streaming royalties. Ad revenue is dependent on a certain threshold of downloads each month, and even if your show is accessed 30,000 times a month, the income you get is actually really minimal. So podcasters like me usually make time in our lives to support our communities and our interests to make these shows, and our most reliable source of income for this work is in fact crowdfunding. In my case, it's my Patreon. So if you'd like to receive ad-free episodes earlier than everyone else, regular newsletters and blog posts, bonus audio content, and support my work, quite literally, please visit patreon.com/creativecontrol today. Thank you so much for listening to this excerpt from a recent episode of Creative Control with Vish Khanna. Every other Creative Control episode is only accessible to Patreon supporters. This is one of them. So please visit patreon.com/creativecontrol and become a subscriber today, and you won't miss a single episode in its entirety. There are links in the show notes to take you right there, so if you're able to, please do support this show and enjoy hours and hours of conversation. Thank you.